Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a new edition of True Crime with the Sarge. I'm your host, Joseph Jekyll, and with us we have a very special guest. This case is going to this story we're going to do today has been absolutely amazing. We're going to be talking about unlocking cold cases with DNA, missing persons, unidentified human remains with Dr. David Mittelman, the founder and CEO of Othram Inc. Doctor, thank you for joining us today. This is very exciting for all of us.
Thanks for having me.
Just on a side note, for the folks that don't know who Dave is, he's been running this cold case stuff. It's been unbelievable. But going back a few years ago, when I was writing the first edition of the cold case handbook, I had reached out to him, and he was nice enough to help me out, get me started on some new topics. So thank you. His name is in our acknowledgement page and everything else that goes along with that. So Dave, I wanted to thank you in person, so to speak, for
Oh,
your
sure,
help in that.
sure.
So just in the last week alone, there's been cases. I mean, I was just looking at the website. Longview Police Department, a baby doe identified from 1988. St. Louis, the medical examiners with Jeremy Clemens identified. Iowa City, Mojave County Sheriff's. That was just in the last 5 days that Othram has been working. So you guys have been really busy doing this.
Yeah, I love priding ourselves on the number of cases we've assisted on, and we've done more of these forensic genetic genealogy cases than any other group on earth. But what I'm really excited about isn't just the number of cases, but as you note, the velocity. So if you're on our website, we have a tracker that shows you what's happened in the last 7 days, the last 30 days, and it's super exciting to see that velocity ramp up. It's not just a lot of cases, but it's a lot of cases even in the last couple of days.
Right. And these cases are 20, 30 years old. Some of these things, these baby doe cases. And just on a side note, every 5 minutes, the website for Othram and where you can find this information is going to be shared in the chat. So make sure you guys follow that along as this is happening. So there's been lots of breaking news about different things. Othram's been involved. We're going to get into it a little bit later on. Some unidentified human remains from the Long Island serial killer case, the Brian Kohlberger case. I mean, you guys have been front and center in just about every major investigation. But before we get into those things, I'd like to know, and the audience does too. Can you give us like the version of how you got involved in the whole forensics and justice part of doing? Because I know you went to Baylor, you were studying medicine and research. How did this all transition into that?
Sure. The fast background on me is I at a very young age I got very interested in the Human Genome Project. It was happening while I was in high school, and I just knew I had to be part of that. I felt like that was going to be a really big impact for humans and for society. So I got involved in that right away. First chance I could get, I got a job building robotics and software to sequence DNA. Back then, the Human Genome Project was a very labor-intensive process. Nowadays, DNA testing is a lot more automated, and got involved in the Human Genome Project. This was at UT Southwestern, and then later, like you said, I trained at Baylor College of Medicine, and all of my work had been biomedical in nature. Eventually left the university, although I've spent about half of my time career-wise at the university. Left the university to go start a few companies, and had a great time helping bring this new DNA technology into the clinic. So, when I first started building companies, and this was like, back in 2010, the MySeq from Illumina was a brand new machine. It wasn't very clear if these kind of new machines would even make it into the clinic. And, by the time that I went to go start Othram, there's essentially a clinic on every street corner using these machines, and diagnostics has become, kind of ubiquitous, and everyone's leveraging these tools. So I wanted to be able to take some of this amazing technology and what I've learned in criminal justice, and we could talk about it more later if you want. But what I've learned in criminal justice is that criminal justice there's just not a huge investment in technology, and so they're using a lot of outdated stuff, and a lot of it's just very manual. And even though I didn't know that at the time, I felt like there was this really great technology that's transformed how we think about medicine and research and even consumer DNA testing. And I was wondering why hasn't this happened in forensics? Medical problems are very important to study, but so are the hundreds of thousands of unidentified persons and unsolved violent crimes. And so it just didn't make sense. And I had a long talk with my wife, who also trained at Baylor College of Medicine. We met in school decades ago, and we do everything together. And I said, there's got to be something that we can do to bring that technology in. So we recruited actually a good team of people, all experts in fields other than forensics. And we asked, if we could imagine forensics in 2018 when we started the company, what would it look like? Like, let's say we know nothing about CODIS or anything else. What would it look like? And then we tried to envision what we thought the future might look like, and we tried to build it. And we spent the last 7 years now, trying to bring it into the forefront. And there's a lot of pieces to that, but certainly showing that we can help law enforcement solve cases is part of it. Part of it is, all these scientific publications that we put into the literature, all open access for people to see. Part of it is going to court, which we've done now more than any other group, and defending it in court. Because if you can't defend it, is it really a useful technology? So all these things to try to help normalize and standardize new technology in this field. But that's kind of the 2-second summary. I've always had an interest in DNA science, and then I really felt like forensics and frankly criminal justice is a high impact problem that people with my skill set weren't really working on. And I like those opportunities. I like to be able to make a disproportionate impact in an area where others are just not, currently investing in.
Right. And I mean, one of the things that when I read about your company back when you guys do all basically put just about everything back into your research and development and just keep on this thing going, which a lot of times, starting out companies don't do that, right? They find something good and then they kind of do, but you guys keep on reinvesting and coming up with new ways of solving these cases.
Yeah, we have a very long-term vision. So every single thing we do is with the intent of reinvesting into figuring out better ways to do it. There was a lot of work and a lot of money spent to bring CODIS and STR testing, which is what people have used for the last 30 years, to bring that nationally. It took a lot of effort, and so it'll take a lot of effort to bring this kind of testing in as well. And again, that's a problem that a lot of people aren't working on. Are there people working on cold cases? Absolutely. And each one of them should be commended for doing that. But in parallel, we need to figure out how to get this technology into the mainstream, so that instead of being a fringe tool you use sometimes or when other things don't work, it becomes a frontline tool. Because here's the real truth that I don't know that everyone understands, which is that DNA sequencing using modern methods is going to identify almost anybody from DNA. And so the fastest, easiest, and cheapest way to solve a violent crime is going to be just testing that DNA that's left behind by the suspect and identifying them.
Right. And unfortunately, we have seen crime clearance rates, including the homicide rate, drop to one of its lowest in the history. I think it was last year or the year before that at like 51%, which has got to be a huge concern for you.
Yeah, did you see I don't know if you saw the article. There was an article in the New York Times 2 months ago in July. There's an article in the New York Times, I think it was July 7th, and it literally says there's a coin flip chance that you'll get caught if you murder someone. And that's best case scenario, because if you just, sexually assault someone or do something else, then there's like a 25% chance. So it's shocking. Even the New York Times has highlighted this issue, that it's a coin flips chance that you'll get caught. And so that's abysmal. It means that, there's not really a deterrent to not harm people. And more importantly, there's an accumulating backlog, because there's all these cases that haven't been solved. And then even if you're solving a few, there's a pileup of new cases each year. So this is clear evidence, even as recently as a few months ago, that we need to change how we approach working these cases.
Yep, and I think they were referring to that statistic I was talking about, the 51% clearance rate. I mean, going back in the 1960s, it was in the 90s, and now we're
Yeah.
down to 51%. And you would figure with all the new DNA technology and forensics and training that the number would be through the roof, but it's not. And a lot of times people say that, DNA has let us down. And I'm like, well, no, things have changed dramatically about even how,
Yeah.
unfortunately, how people are killed or go missing. I mean, the things are much different now. What is some of the what is the difference between your technology and what we see in other labs? We know that you guys have been leaps and bounds above other laboratories.
Well,
What makes you guys different?
there's a couple things. So it would help for those that aren't, queued up necessarily on the difference between this kind of testing and standard testing, to point out that, when you do STR testing to build a profile for CODIS, which is the FBI's database, that works by taking DNA, collecting 20 data points, and then they get put into the database, and you're either in the database or not. If you've committed a crime and you've been convicted, you're in the database. If not, you're not. And so that's why they call it DNA fingerprinting. It works kind of like a fingerprint. If they have your DNA fingerprint, then they can tell you yes or no, you're in the database, just like with a fingerprint. But also, like with a fingerprint, if I have a fingerprint on a piece of evidence and I don't have that fingerprint in my database, I really don't know much about the person that left it. And this is the same thing true for DNA. So the first difference is that we've transitioned from using 20 markers to using, a 500,000 to 1,000,000 markers, hundreds of thousands of DNA data points that can tell you a lot more than you are or are not in a database. It can tell you something about your historical origins. Where in the world are you from? Where is your family from? And then it eventually can be used in conjunction with tools like genetic genealogy to trace down who you actually are. So that's one big high level difference. But then you ask, like, how does what we do differ from everyone else? Why are we at this velocity? So here's the thing. And again, another kind of thing I learned about forensics. I'm new to forensics. I guess I'm not new anymore, but I was new when I started. And what I discovered is that, again, there's just not a huge investment for whatever reason in technology. And so when technology does make it into forensics, I feel like it is, it's almost an unfair situation. It's like the leftover tidbits of adjacent, industries technology. So there's a lot of ways to do DNA testing, but there are not a lot of ways to do DNA testing on forensic DNA, which is generally degraded and it's chemically damaged and has all these issues. And so when we started the company, the very first thing we thought about is like, do we need to build a lab, right? Like we can work on the analysis. If we're collecting more data, we can do things with this. Why can't we just use any DNA lab? And what we learned is that most of these laboratories, in fact, the vendors that make this equipment have been very clear, like the threshold for usable DNA on these instruments and on these workflows is very high. I mean, they're expecting a blood draw, a swab from your cheek. They're certainly not expecting a mixture of multiple people. So the secret here is, and it's not really a secret, it's almost obvious once you hear it, is that you have to take every part of this workflow, every laboratory step, every software step, and you've got to purpose build it for forensics. So again, there's a lot of ways to test DNA. There's not a lot of ways to test crappy DNA. And there's a lot of ways to analyze it, but there's not a lot of ways to analyze it specifically for forensics. And so we took every part of the pipeline. When we built the lab, we didn't take any casework right away. We just started, optimizing every piece using mock, DNA casework and waited till we had something that we thought was fully optimized. If you look at something like you look at something like an iPhone, right? Like there's not a lot of like, patented secret technology in an iPhone. There's some design patents. I mean, an iPhone is comprised of very ordinary parts. It's just been engineered, such that each part works well together and towards a common purpose. And that's really the approach that we took here. It's like a complex coordination of lots of little parts from lots of little fields. Same with genealogy. There's a lot of ways to do genealogy, but there aren't a lot of good ways to do genealogy when you have only a few databases that you can look at. You've got hundreds of thousands of cases waiting, and you just literally can't rely on pure manual effort. You have to take those steps to see how you can automate and simplify the workflows. So everything we did was with the intent of being purpose built for forensics so we can get the best outcome. Our motto at Othram is best case scenario, so that, every time we do something, we're like, is this best for the case or not? And then the second part was make sure that it's purpose built so that we can defend it in court, right? If you go to court and you're like, I downloaded a tool off the internet and, I ran my DNA through it and it said whatever, defense is going to say, hey, this wasn't even validated. So I think validation is an underappreciated thing. Again, publishing in peer-reviewed scientific literature, so a body of your peers can dissect it, interrogate it, complain about it, and improve it. That's all really important. And these are like the non-glamorous things. In the media, they're like, hey, a case was solved. And so you don't cover in the media necessarily all the boring steps that are just so important. But when you get these parts together, it's magic. And all of a sudden you have scale. We can run, hundreds of cases at a time. We run genealogy in a semi-automated fashion, and that'll continue to improve. And we produce really world-class documentation that explains exactly how results are achieved. Those documents then go to court, and it really helps us in the long term. We're not accumulating the kind of debt that others are accumulating in kind of just setting up a ragtag team and pulling parts from different places. It's really all purpose built just for forensics.
Right, and you start off with the small wins, and you work your way up into bigger ones, right? I mean, that's basically the because the different kind of standards that states have too about the admissibility of new forensic
Yes, yes,
technology.
yeah. So, we went early on, we went through the Daubert hearing, and then we've had to go through other kinds of hearings pre-trial to vet the work that we're doing. I will tell you that we continue to this day to have the same philosophy. So, so I don't know if it's 25 or 30%, but 25 or 30% of the time, my lab will say, I don't want the evidence. I don't feel ready to run this. Because like you said, you start with the wins and then you work your way out. So we find things, and as part of our suitability analysis, a lot of groups will just say, oh, well, there's enough DNA. and I check these boxes, I'm going to go run it. That's not how we approach it. When we look at DNA that comes in, again, we've run more of these casework evidence samples than anyone else on earth. We've got thousands and thousands of data points. And when we look at a new piece of DNA, we ask, are the properties of this DNA something that I've seen before work in my hands and produce a good outcome? Because remember, when you test DNA, you destroy it. It's consumed in the process. You don't get it back. And so if you don't get a match or you don't get good information, you don't get a refund on the DNA. And so it's very important to us that we reject casework that we don't feel confident in. And to this day, we're the only facility that has a forensic lab, ISO 17025 accredited, that does the casework. And then we have a separate physical lab, like physically separated, different human beings, that is just a research lab. And what we do all day long is we collect the things that we can't work, generate mock casework, and we experiment and we develop new products, new laboratory methods, new software tools. And when we feel really confident, then we introduce those into the forensic lab, and then we'll call up all the people. It's very common for us to tell someone, I can't work this case. We'll come back like 4, 6, 7, or 8 months later and say, I'm ready. Give me the evidence. And it's allowed us to keep a really high success rate because I think, frankly, it's better not to touch the evidence than it is to touch it and then fail.
Right. And you guys you get all of your casework from law enforcement, right? You don't get anything from the family members, stuff like that, but you are open to family members telling you about cases, but everything comes through law enforcement agencies, correct?
Yeah, I think the most accurate way to say would be like the criminal justice community, because we've had prosecutors. We can take work from prosecutors, from
Mhm.
defense attorneys, right? Like we want it. We want this technology to be equitably applied everywhere. So you should be trying to exonerate people as much as you are trying to find people that did something. So if you're in the criminal justice community, then that's our actual end user. A court could say, I want this DNA tested, and we'll follow the court order and do it. But we do want to work with families. Ultimately, our ultimate stakeholder is the families, right? If the families are happy, then I know we're doing the right thing. And if they're not happy, we need to change our approach. It's just that, as I'm sure you know, the evidence, the custodian of the evidence is usually law enforcement or the medical examiner or the coroner. So we need their buy-in. But we are always happy to hear from families, from anyone, really anyone on the earth. We're happy to hear from. But we do, as a final step, need law enforcement or some member of the criminal justice community, a court order, to essentially give us permission to access that evidence and then go do something with it. And it's not just because we need the permission, it's because, again, like, you don't just want to solve a case, you want to solve a case and then be able to prosecute it properly. And so that means chain of custody. Just means a lot of things have to line up so that you can do something that'll actually have a true good impact.
Right. And it goes hand in hand with your mission statement about forensics and justice for all. And justice is not a luxury. It's a basic human right, and that's
We're very
basically
excited about that. We pride ourselves on giving the Bureau the same outcomes that we give the smallest, most rural agency in America. In fact, we ended up building another facility aside from the forensic lab, the core forensic lab and the research lab. We have our own skeletal facility. So, I mean, if you're a small agency, you've got a sheriff and maybe one deputy. You've got no scientist, no anthropologist, no lab. You can literally put the remains that you found in the woods in a FedEx box. We tell them, if you can use a FedEx label, you can solve a crime. That's it. Put it in a box and go. And you get the same outcomes that the Bureau gets when they send us a human remains case. So it's very important for us to develop the technology, make it robust so it works on all cases and not some. And then we want it to be equitably available to all agencies. Everyone should have access to this technology.
right. I mean, and how many cases do you have actively going on at one time? How many can the lab handle? I
I
know it
mean,
can
the lab
vary.
can handle far more than we have. We spent a lot of time engineering the lab for scale, so we could, we run tons of cases at a time. I don't know exactly how many, but
But
we're nowhere near capacity. And I want to point out our goal is, I don't want to build, the lab core of forensics. So I don't want to be like the central lab testing agency. What we started doing this year is deploying our workflows, deploying software. We have software that we developed as part of an Air Force project that allows you to do a lot of the analysis that Othram does. No internet connection required, no special computers. You literally load it on your laptop, same laptop you're podcasting on. You can load it up and be doing the analysis. So we're trying to build the tools to distribute it to everyone. The lab we built here in the Woodlands, Texas, was designed as a showcase. If I would have come to you and said, hey, I've got a really great approach to solving cases, you would have said, prove it. So we built a lab to prove it, but our goal is not to run more and more and more casework. Our goal is to basically perfect the tools, refine them, and then distribute them to all the public labs. And I think there's like a couple hundred public labs in this country, all of which could benefit from upgrading their capabilities and being able to take on at least some of this work. And much like with STR testing, even though CODIS testing is something that all public labs can do, there's still a need when there's an overflow to outsource. And I think that's the role of the private forensic company is to handle that overflow. But when possible, I would love for the technology be deployed actually to the site where it's happening. There's no reason to move evidence back and forth if you don't have to.
Right. And one of the things you had mentioned, a big keyword for me when you mentioned chain of custody. Now, from law enforcement perspective, I mean, we find this still even a problem to this day in 2025 where police departments are doing it. Are there any issues that you see coming from police departments that need to be addressed, such as chain of custody, stuff like that, so it makes your job easier?
Well, we early on designed a process with the support and buy-in of law enforcement. So the the way things work with us is that when let's say you're at an agency, you're at NYPD and you want to send something to Othram, you pre-register the item you're going to send to us in our system, and then we issue a barcode and shipping instructions, and that barcode goes on the outside of the box. And so, first of all, when the item comes to us, we know that it's tied to casework from the very moment we get it because we scan the barcode and it associates it with the right case. That starts the chain of custody process on our end. And so that goes a long way. It's like I think I don't know how everyone does it, but I would be very anxious if, for example, you just mail something in and hope that they figure it out. So we pre-register everything. We get a manifest of what they're sending. Upon receiving it, we confirm that we got what they said they're going to get. If not, we reconcile it. There are high-profile cases where they don't even want to rely on a shipping provider or a carrier, and they hand deliver it, and that's fine too. So we have a setup. We have a station where you can literally hand deliver the evidence, but basically you'll exchange identification, begin chain of custody there, and then we track it through our lab, and we'll do a kind of a visual inspection of the package, the box inside the package, the tube inside the box inside the package. And so each step of the way, we're visually deconstructing it, marking the identifiers, and we can walk you through, if we had to, the item as it hits our doorstep, either through a carrier or a human that's personally delivered it from the agency, all the way down to taking it to the core evidence or the DNA extract that was sent, all the way back up. So, and then we prepare that documentation, and it's part of our discovery packet. So I think chain of custody is ultra important, but it hasn't been hard for us to adhere to that process. And I think part of the success is, again, pre-registering and knowing what we're receiving, and then flagging it if we don't receive what we expect to receive.
Right. And reason why I asked that question, because I figured that's going to be where one of the defense attorneys, that's where they're going to
Yeah, of
weigh in
course.
on. And that's because
Yeah.
that's the big thing.
Yeah, the first thing you complain about is, was there a chain of custody? Or if there was it interrupted? The second thing you do is check all the signatures and dates. And it's like, is this date wrong? Did someone make a mistake? I can't tell you how many times we've been in a pretrial situation and someone says, the date was wrong where they signed it. And then, you have to explain, why was it wrong? Is it really wrong? There's something else. So I think looking for like obvious mistakes and interruptions in chain of custody are like the first thing to examine as a defense attorney. And so, you can make things easier by just doing it right. Don't make mistakes on dates, sign in the right places, and make sure you're adhering to a chain of custody protocol that makes sense.
Right. I mean, I figured as much. I mean, that's got to be the first area that they're going to go to. I mean, what are some of the other areas that you think defense attorneys will key in on some of this new
Well,
technology?
yeah. So once you demonstrate that there's no typos in the paperwork, and you demonstrate that there's chain of custody, the next question is going to be, why did you use this bizarre new technology? It's new. It's the Wild West. You hear a lot of that on the internet, right? This is the Wild West of forensics. I'll tell you right now, like we've been in operation for 7 years. It's not the Wild West. People that are doing things, willy nilly, they're just not, they're not using best practices. And I think one area that people can attack is like, when you say, I want to solve your case, but I'm not going to personally solve it. I'm going to send it to this lab, and then I'm going to send it to this team for analysis, and this guy's going to do some computer stuff. Now you're passing things around and you're creating complexity, and that's something that a defense team can dissect. One thing I love about Othram is that, the evidence arrives to Othram, and that's the end of the story. The next part of the story, which is chapter 2, is it goes back, and that's it. Well, we don't have we don't outsource anywhere. We don't have all this, complex networks of interacting players. We're all Othram people doing Othram stuff. And so that goes a long way in making it a lot simpler. If you can convince them that, you've done everything in house, which I think is far better than, like I said, outsourcing to a bunch of people. Then the next problem is, is it new and wild and crazy? And then you convince them it's not new, wild, and crazy. We've been doing it for 7 years. And then they'll tell you, well, but is it validated? Is it this? Is it that? So there's like a whole line of things that you go through. And, I don't want to be dismissive. It's good. Honestly, it's good. I've enjoyed going to court, and I've enjoyed answering these questions because I don't really care what needs to be done. What I care about is building defensible answers. And so if a defense team raises a valid point, like, did you validate it this way versus that way, then that's great information. And then we go take that knowledge back, validate it. We publish a peer-reviewed paper, which is really the state of the art. Is it required by accreditation? No. I don't know why, but apparently you can validate, in a secret closet somewhere, and you don't have to tell anyone, and it seems to work. But we believe in, giving back to the field, so we'll publish it in a peer-reviewed paper. And then here's the thing: it's out there in the peer-reviewed literature, and you can read it, you can complain about it, and if you don't complain about it, it makes it really hard then when you go to court to say that you have a problem with it, because it's been in the literature now for some number of years. So that's there's, and I'm sure there's other things. I'm not a lawyer, so take any legal advice I give you with a grain of salt. But that's kind of the workflow, the 101 to how to argue about evidence. Then you can argue about the condition of the evidence. You can argue about, how reliable the findings are. There's probably no limit to what you can argue about. And then if you're in a high profile case like the Kohlberger case, then you can find like one person on the fringe of forensics that'll say whatever you want them to say, and maybe they'll I don't know, I want to be polite, but they'll unintentionally or intentionally misrepresent information to make it less easy to understand. There's two reasons people ask questions in the world. One is to uncover the truth, and the other is to obscure the truth. And sometimes you can find an expert that will ask questions that seem like questions, but they're designed to kind of complicate and make things more confusing. That's what happened in the Kohlberger case. That's why there's so much confusion in that case. And yeah, that's really, I think, the crux of dissecting this. That's for the DNA side. Of course, the defense will have a lot of questions and concerns about other aspects of the analysis. Did the cops do things the right way? Did the detective do this versus this? And I have no skill set there.
Yeah,
but on the DNA side, I think
your problem, though.
These are the most common things that people ask for on the DNA side.
Right. I mean, you brought up Kohlberger, so you guys identified the DNA off the sheet, correct? Is that how it worked? Right.
Well, to be clear, the Idaho State Police Forensic Services took the sheath. And from that button snap, they were able to identify DNA. They found DNA, and they took that DNA, made it, and ran an STR test. Othram's not involved here. They take that STR, upload it to CODIS. There's no hit. And because there's no hit, they then take the rest of the DNA that they still have. They had plenty of DNA. There was tons of DNA on this knife snap, on this button snap. And they took the extra DNA and hand delivered it to Othram and said, okay, now you build your kind of profile and see if you can help us identify the person. So that's how it happened.
Gotcha. Now, another big case that you're dealing with in some of the unidentified human remains from the Long Island serial killer case.
Yeah.
So you have identified Karen Vagata, and Karen Vagata was, I think it was August of 2023, if I remember correctly. You identified her. Her case has been getting some, chatter amongst on the internet stuff. So I wonder if something is brewing with that. And then in April 2025, you had a big breakthrough that helped identify Peaches and her daughter, Tanya Jackson and Tatiana.
Yeah.
So it's actually kind of exciting because that case was 25, 30 years old, some of these cases, and all of a sudden now we have names to the faces.
Yeah, and I hate this idea of us having Wi-Fi on every street corner, but we still can't identify people that were murdered. Like it's terrible. Like there needs to be a real focus. If there's human remains that are not identified, they have to be identified. So many years back, there was an effort to go identify these bodies along Gilgo Beach and that whole kind of shore, right? And so here's the problem. First of all, a lot of the remains are in terrible shape, and before Othram was contacted, they tried a couple other methods and a couple other labs, and they had no success. They were not even able to build a DNA profile. If you can't build the DNA profile, there's no genetic genealogy, and there's no identification. You're screwed. So the first problem they had is they can't build any profiles. And they actually came to me and said, here's the data that we got from, lab X. And I said, look, I know we can do better. Send us the remains. We're going to work from scratch. And this goes back to like what I was telling you. There's a lot of ways to extract DNA, to test DNA, but there aren't a lot of ways to do it when the material is terrible. So we started from scratch. We're able to build really good DNA extracts and find these folks. And this was a collaboration between the local agency, between Othram and the Bureau. So in the case of Peaches and her daughter, the Bureau was doing the genetic genealogy based on a profile we had built. And as a result, she and her daughter are identified. There are other cases in the works. Everyone is, I see someone is waiting
Yep,
for,
Asian male dope.
yeah,
Yep.
yep, yeah. And look, when you're East Asian, you're going to be a little bit tougher to identify. But here's the thing: is once you've got a profile and foundational good quality data, like it's just a matter of time. And so, and the other thing that's really important to notice, and I think why maybe Karen's case has gotten a lot of attention, is Karen Vergata might have been one of the earliest victims, right, of the Long Island serial killer. But here's the thing: just because we've identified her and just because her body's on the beach doesn't mean that necessarily he's a suspect, right? So there's a lot of investigative work that we don't want to downplay, a lot of investigative work then to figure it out. The problem is there's so many bodies on that beach, and they can't even begin to figure out which of those cases belong to the Long Island serial killer case until you identify them. Once you identify them, you're like, okay, who was the person? Do they fit the profile? Do I have evidence? And so I think identifying them is important for the humanitarian reason of getting them back to family, but it's critical in the criminal proceedings because you can't blame someone for doing something if you don't even know who the victim is. And so that's where I think in the long term, there's a lot of value to making sure we can identify these folks because we can figure out which one of them are actually victims of this person. And if they're not, then guess what? We need to go find out who is responsible for their death.
Right. I mean, and putting the names back to people. I mean, that talk about that justice and talk about that human right. I mean, I think everybody should be
Yeah,
buried with their name.
I find it abhorrent that we have, I find it abhorrent that we even have a NamUs system that there's at this moment, I looked before I logged on with you, it's like over 15,000 people unidentified in that database. There shouldn't be 15,000 people.
Right.
Most of those
And
have DNA. They should be tested, and they should be identified, and they should be matched back to families.
yeah, I mean, it's ironic you brought up NamUs because I was going to ask you when in 2022, when then President Joe Biden passed two major laws, Help Find the Missing Act with the Billy Smolinski law, which was supposed to take NamUs and put it into NCIC. I don't think that's ever been done yet. I mean, so that to me is a real big disappointment. And then the Homicide Victims' Rights Act. And this is a sweet spot for Othram if this thing ever can get off the ground, because this is for federal cases. The cases have to be 3 years old, and then they have to go through this review process looking for DNA. I mean, why do we see something good like this, and then all of a sudden just get let down?
I have to tell you, this is one of the hardest cases that Othram's never been able to solve. Is like, why don't people know about NamUs and why don't they care? I think I think this is a really important project. Several administrations have worked on this. In fact, I'll tell you, like as far back as the first Trump administration, right? They set up that Operation Spirit Return and that project to address the missing and murdered indigenous, and that project took years to get off the ground. And then there was a new administration, and they had invested in interest, but again, it didn't take off the ground. And then only in this most recent presidency, all of a sudden we get a phone call, BIA is ready to go, and we've had a lot of success. It's adjacent to NamUs. We work with NamUs, but helping the Bureau of Indian Affairs work through the cases of missing and murdered, because there's a number of these folks that have not had the attention of investigative effort, the funding to work these cases, and the technology. And now it's available. It was mandated 2 presidencies ago, and we're still waiting for it to roll out. And it began to roll out, so no complaints. I'm thrilled. But yeah, it sometimes takes a long time. And from my perspective, I think NamUs should be a focus. It's not a question of technology. It's a question of priority. And, I was at CrimeCon. I was asked to give a talk at CrimeCon this year. And my very first slide was unsolved cases are a choice. And I it may sound scandalous, but I really believe that. I believe these unsolved cases are a choice. It's a choice that we make. I'm not blaming anybody, but it's a choice we make as a society and as a country. We choose if we want to address those or not. If you wanted to address all the unidentified, then, like you said, there's a lot of infrastructure improvements you can make to NamUs, and you could just empty the database. The technology is there, the interest is there. Nobody thinks it's a bad idea to identify NamUs people. So, the people in NamUs, maybe half of them at least are victims of homicide or some violent act. So you definitely want to identify them because it even contributes to public safety. You will uncover folks that have done terrible things and have gone undetected because the victim's unidentified. So yeah, I wish I had an answer. In my books, it's still an unsolvable case. It's the white whale of unsolved cases is why we haven't done more with NamUs.
Right. I mean, Namus is, I've been a big proponent of it from when it first started. When I was in cold case or when I was actually retiring, it was becoming very popular. And at the time I had met Todd Matthews. I don't know if you knew Todd, but he was
He
one
was
of
a
the
good friend.
original guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a really nice guy. And we became friends over the years. And we actually did some training together in some different aspects. And I had so much high hopes for this. My only concern is, when if this thing actually does get integrated into NCIC, because it would be part of the FBI's database, would they knock out the component of having civilians being able to enter stuff because it's like it's a gateway into the FBI.
I think there's a way. I think there's a way to reconcile and harness the support of everyone that wants to participate. There's when someone expresses enthusiasm for something, particularly something that doesn't get enough visibility, I think the worst thing you could do is turn them away. So, but then the question is like, what's the appropriate way to express that enthusiasm and that effort? And there's always a way to do that. I'll tell you that we've been working with NamUs since 2022. So when RTI won the contract. They're the prime on the NamUs contract. We partnered with RTI and became their forensic genetic genealogy provider. And in the first 18 months, this is wild, and you can fact check me on this. In the first 18 months that we worked together, we had identified, with DNA, more folks than in the entire history of NamUs. Like it's so remarkable, and it works. And I got to tell you, the RTI folks, they work overtime. They're breaking their backs to do the most that they can do with the budget they have, but they need to be recognized and they need to be resourced. And every time we announce a case as it being solved, we always credit NamUs. We always mention the NamUs ID because we want people to understand, like, even though that's not the that's not the last step that was taken to identify someone, there was a lot of foundational work at NamUs to even surface that case in the first place. And it's something I spent a lot of time talking to Todd about. He would tell me about these cases where civilians would find things in the newspaper about some remains case, and they surface it to the agency that then discovers, yes, in fact, there's an unidentified person, and then that has to go into the database. And if it's not on the database, Othram's not going to know about it, and neither will anyone else. So it's a tremendous value. I couldn't understate it, and I would say anyone that cares even a little bit about cold cases and human remains, anyone that cares about this at all should be heavily advocating and speaking up to the praise of what NamUs has been able to achieve. I think it's an important program. I just think it's horribly under-resourced. But everyone involved in NamUs that I've ever met, including the folks all the way up at the NIJ, are just on fire about it. Like, everyone understands the importance. It's just a matter of slotting in the prioritization against other objectives. And it's not something for me to weigh in on because I don't work for the government. I don't know the 30 other things they're working on, but I do hope there's more resourcing really soon. We've definitely demonstrated with RTI that there's huge value and impact that can be created with just a little bit of technology and investigative effort.
Yeah, and I think honestly the governors of every state should be instituting the law. I know, at the time Governor Cuomo, before he had to resign up in New York, he passed the rule that all missing unidentified person case all has to go through NamUs. Everything has to go through that. So I mean, New York's a very big state, right? But we want to see other states like California and Texas
Yeah,
and
of
and
course.
those kind of things.
And you can understand, like, maybe 10 years ago, people were like, why do I have to upload to NamUs? Because I put it on NamUs and it doesn't get solved anyway. But now with new technology and with this velocity of solving, like, you have to, if you want to mandate people to use NamUs, you also have to explain to them the upside, which is that if you put a case into NamUs, there's a good chance it's going to get solved now. It's really exciting. And we're building at Othram a bunch of tools that allow you to analyze case files automatically using AI, allow you to kind of parse through information more quickly. And we're hoping that some of those tools, we can provide to NamUs, should RTI and the NIJ want to go that direction, to maybe even make it easier and easier. Like, if we can lower the bar for how hard it is to upload to NamUs, which I don't think it's very hard, but if we can make it even easier, and we can educate people that putting things in NamUs doesn't mean it's just going into a registry. It means that there's actually going to be resourcing applied to work the case. I don't think you'd have to even mandate it. I think people would be excited. I've never met a detective that said, I don't really want to solve that case. but
Yeah,
they themselves are trying to prioritize
right.
their effort. So you got to tell them, like, there's a huge win for you if you get it into NamUs. Let's go do it. Get it into NamUs. Let's figure out how we can get the case worked. And so if we can build tools to help, then we'd like to do that as well. And we've been working on a lot of tools to help, work through some of these case files are gigantic. There could be, 500 to 1,000 pages of images and text and other documents. And that all needs to be, kind of summarized, analyzed, and interpreted before you start that DNA testing.
Well, I can tell you from my experience, I've been retired now 13 years from the police department, and there are still a couple of cases I carry with me that I check up on every now and then. So yes, there are people out there who do this for a living
Yeah.
that they want to see these cases, solved. So it's a really important aspect. So yeah, NamUs is the great tool that nobody wants to really embrace, so to speak. It looks like, and it's something that needs to be fixed, and that has to be done at a legislative level,
At the federal level,
basically.
yeah. And Kristen on our team, that's why Kristen wakes up every morning. She wakes up every morning. She works with governor's offices. She works with state legislators, and then she also is out in DC all the time talking to all these folks. And she has a number of objectives that she's working on. And but the very first thing she'll always say is, "Hey, have you heard of NamUs?" And if they haven't, she'll give them a little bit of a kind of a summary. Here's what NamUs is about, and so on. So a good part of our work, I talked about the science and the purpose-built things and the peer-reviewed publications and the court testimony, but the orthogonal part to this is, like you said, it's got to get on the agenda. And if you're not, you can't send an email and say, "Hey, please put this on your agenda." So Kristen will fly out to DC and she will sit in person with these representatives and with the senators, and she gets in there right in their face and shows them, like, here's what needs to be done. And again, I got to say, like, members of the House and the Senate, they've been very, very excited about this. A lot of the time, they don't know there's a problem. So one of two things. Sometimes they think that they don't realize there's a backlog of cases. Or the second thing is they actually don't realize that it hasn't been addressed because they may have in a previous fiscal year supported legislation that created funding for whatever. Like you brought up a point, like, president's office says money for this. And they may think, okay, the money was deployed, now the problem's solved. And they don't realize that it wasn't solved or that there's still an issue. So I think part of Kristen's job is also just keeping the latest stats and the latest information alive in their minds so they realize there's an ongoing need to support this work. She's
Right.
very
And
good at
one of the things that I've talked to, politiciians about specifically is that they don't understand sometimes that these individuals that are unidentified are transient. They came from another state. They come to New York. They
Yes.
find them. You find them deceased. You don't know who they are. You put it into, that's what NamUs is all about. So that if there's a DNA hit from Wisconsin, and now all of a sudden we have this individual in New York, now you put two and two together. I mean, that to me is the largest idea that you can actually think of in a grand scale on how to solve more cases.
Yeah, if there was ever an initiative that should be led by the federal government, this is one of them because we may be from this state or that state, but we're all Americans, and we're all here in America, and so there needs to be a federally coordinated effort to make sure that even if you've crossed to another state, that there are resources and tools available to make sure that you can make it back to your family even after death.
Right. Yeah, make it like a clearinghouse, right? Where there's certain aspects that have to be cleared through casework, through the
Yeah.
law enforcement and the medical examiners and the coroner system, which is always an issue
Well,
in
you don't
this
have to sell
country.
meat. And I think
Right.
back to my earlier point is, like, as you deploy technology to the public labs, to the medical examiners, like we're building technology that I think will make it very easy for even you don't need to have like a full lab setup. Like medical examiners and coroners could use, partial setups to start doing some of this work up front as well, particularly if they already have an idea of who the person might be, or they want to rule out some possibilities. So I think this is a very solvable problem. As I said, unsolved cases are a choice, and it's just a matter of prioritizing this work. The technology and the implementation at this point in 2025 is pretty straightforward. I don't think you could have said that even 5 years ago, but today it's pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of doing it, or like
Do
you
we
said,
see?
legislating
Yeah.
it.
Do we see a future where Othram will have, I guess, an annex lab in all kinds of states across the country to help with those hand deliveries to eliminate some of that chain of custody issues and that kind of stuff?
I mean, my fantasy would be to deploy Othram technology within the walls of existing labs. Like there's already a bunch of labs that are accredited and do exceptional
Mhm.
work. So why would you build a new lab next door to them? Like why not bring the technology to them? But if there was a use case to build another Othram location, and maybe there will be a use case to build a few, certainly don't mind doing that. particularly in the states that have been heavily invested in the technique. But I think most of the time you can probably find labs that are just really on fire about it, want to do the work, but they just need some technology upgrades. And I would love to work with them. We already work with labs anyway. I would love to work with them to deploy the tools they need to be able to do this themselves.
Right. I was thinking like in the line of like state police labs, right, where you have a center
Exactly.
of
Yeah.
location for each state
Yeah.
already, where most evidence is done. Like, look, take a look at Idaho, right? Everything had to go through the state lab.
Yeah, and yeah,
So
I don't know if you know the director of the Idaho State Lab.
I do not.
He's a super smart guy. He's very forward looking. Of course he is, because he went and applied a very powerful technique on an active case before a lot of other folks had done that. And yeah, like in another situation, if that ever happened again, God forbid, hopefully it doesn't. Why does he need to send the evidence to Othram? Like why can't he be funded and resourced to have that technology himself? And I think that's probably where his future lies. But obviously, back in 2022, when this crime occurred, it just wasn't the case. The funding and the tools weren't available. So, but now they are. So yeah, whether you're in the Idaho State Lab, whether you're in Texas, which is our home state, whether you're in New York, one of the largest medical examiner offices in the country, you should have these tools available to you. And
I mean,
there's. Oh, go ahead.
no, I'm sorry. Like New York City, a lot of people don't realize it, but I think it's like the largest biology lab in the country
It's an
at this
amazing,
point.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. If they would, yeah, this is there's certainly not a lack of need. So it'd be a great place to do things. And we've done a lot of work in New York. I believe we've worked more forensic genetic genealogy cases in New York than anyone else. We've identified, the first folks that were identified in the 5 boroughs and in the capital region. I think we had the first conviction. It was a UHR. We identified a guy that was a World War I veteran, and
Yep, in Queens.
yeah, the Queens DA prosecuted it successfully. This is why NamUs is so important. They had these remains, and they're from way long ago. And you would think like, I don't care, it's not my family. But not only did we get an answer back to the family, they found the guy that was responsible, and he was
Yep.
successfully prosecuted. So it's really important. It's really, really important for all these reasons. And we've loved working in New York. We love working everywhere in the U.S. And again, I hope that in the very near future, really, I hope in the coming months that a lot of these labs start to step up to bring these tools in house. But it's going to require more than just their interest. It's going to require funding and mandate. And so one thing that Kristen's been working on is the Carla Walker Act. This was introduced bicamerally, so it's in the Senate and the House. It's got bipartisan support. When's the last time you saw a bill that was championed by Peter Welsh in Vermont, John Cornyn in Texas, Eric Swalwell, Hunt in Houston, which is our hometown district? I mean, there's a lot of diverse personalities and political opinions. All 4 of these guys getting together saying, you know what? It's so important that we address this problem of unsolved crime and unidentified human remains. We're all going to get together. Like I just don't know of another initiative. Like everything in the world these days, even sports, everything's politicized. It's like the one last thing we can all agree on is like you shouldn't murder people, and you should identify human remains. And so to see bipartisan support, it makes me very excited. The bill's been introduced. It's got some additional steps. I'm no expert on that stuff. That's why I defer to Kristen. But things are going well. The senators are talking. The House reps are talking. And that bill doesn't just open up the technology for law enforcement, but in fact, half of the money that's going to open up in that bill is specifically for labs, only public labs, not private labs or anyone else, only for public labs like the one in Idaho to be able to get funding to build the technology in-house to do all this. So it's a really great bill because it'll allow people to get immediate relief while at the same time building the infrastructure they need to become independent users of the technology.
Talk about a no-brainer idea too, right? I mean, like, how do we even have to put this up to vote? I mean, like,
Well,
how do you
I got
vote
to tell
against
you,
this?
like, again, the bipartisan support, I think, is a good indicator that people realize it's an important initiative. And one last thing, the icing on the cake, which is my favorite part of this bill, is that at the end of all this, there are metrics that are collected, and so the future funding events are outcome driven, right? So it's not just get money to buy equipment and get money to do stuff, but it's what was the outcome? Because I think that's the other thing missing in criminal justice is like it needs to be outcome based. If you're funding something indefinitely but there are no outcomes, then you got to change approach. And you need to look at many approaches. You need to ask which one is driving the outcomes and what is the dollar per outcome. And then you want to find the most cost effective way to deliver the most impact and outcomes to Americans because we're using their tax dollars. So, anyways, I'm very excited about that bill. There's other things in the work as well. And then, even while we're waiting for a federal initiative, which I think is really the key to nationalizing this, there have been many versions of that bill that have been instantiated at the state level. Like Florida was one of the early states to produce state funding that specifically called out forensic genetic genealogy, and the results have been wild. And Washington State, so again, political spectrums that are different. Washington State also invested in resourcing, the identifications of all these folks. And so if you go to our website and you look at, like, we have a DNA Solve site where you can look by state at what's been happening. There's a strong correlation, right, between the states that have introduced legislation and the states that are churning out, the solves. So it's again further proof that it's not the interest of the agency, it's not politics, and it's not technology. It's wherever the state has legislated it and asked for it to be a priority, all of a sudden there's magical success and outcomes.
Yeah, and like I said, it's some of those senators and Congress people that you named have been on the bills, now laws of Billy Smolinski,
Yeah.
and there's the other, I forgot his name. He's from Connecticut. He was big with the Billy Smolinski law too. I forgot his
Yes.
name.
Yeah, and Eric Swalwell previously, wanted to advocate for reopening cold cases, right? And so that's great, but when you reopen it, you want to apply technology. And so we asked that he consider, a bill that really would, push technology towards the application of the cases. John Cornyn is a legend in DNA legislation. Did a lot of the work to help, make NamUs and the conventional DNA testing process a part of everyone's workflow. So it just makes sense to get these guys that already have an interest to band together to work on this problem. So I couldn't be more thrilled. I think it's just a matter of time. I don't think that Americans will tolerate, the solve rates and the clearance rates that you'd mentioned indefinitely, but it's easier to tolerate when you don't know about it. So as people kind of speak the truth and tell people what the actual magnitude of the problem is, and as it becomes more obvious that there's already tools available right now, so it really is a choice if you choose to work these cases, I think that they'll become a tipping point in which essentially the American people will demand outcomes. And when that happens, it'll be like every time Americans demand something, the government will act.
Yep. As they said, we the people say we want this, and that's the bottom line. Let's talk with the few minutes we have left. DNA solves. Tell us about that.
DNA Solves is a website we built early on. We chronicle the stories of cases that were solved. They're all solved with DNA technology, but the way they're solved are all different. They're interesting to look at. And it helps you kind of see the true power of this technology and how universally useful it can be. It doesn't matter where in the world the case happened, when it happened, who it happened to, regardless of circumstance, time, and geography, every case has a fair chance at a solve. And I think DNA Solves demonstrates that. The second thing is that early on, people were telling us, well, like, what if there's a legal issue? What if there's a technical issue? So we started crowdfunding cases, and we still do. We'll crowdfund cases that don't have funding yet. Hopefully that's not necessary forever. And the weird thing is when you crowdfund the case, it gets solved. And so that becomes really good proof, and data is like, wait a second, if the only thing that was stopping this case from getting worked was money, well, then that's a legislative problem. That's not a problem with technology or the law. So that's our DNA Solves site. And then we actually have gone a little further because, only so many people want to read about DNA Solves cases. We started a podcast. It's called America's Crime Lab. And you can check it out on all the major platforms. It's an iHeart podcast. And America's Crime Lab, we've actually now started telling the stories of these cases. Except instead of Othram telling the stories, which is how DNA Solves is written, it's Othram telling the story. On America's Crime Lab, we actually get the investigators, the lab personnel, the public labs, and the families of the victims to tell the story from their perspective. And I think that goes a long way because, obviously, I'm sure you can tell from this conversation, I'm very excited about this topic. I could discuss it forever. But it's even more impactful not to hear it from David, but to hear it from the actual families that were impacted. And you don't have to listen to very many episodes of that podcast before, like, you almost feel bad that you haven't put more effort to make sure more families can have those outcomes. So we've got DNA Solves, which has been the site we've used for years to drive awareness and make a point basically about what really is limiting the use of the technology. And then America's Crime Lab, which is our podcast.
And if the general public wanted to donate to DNA Solves, they can, correct?
Yeah, if you go to DNA Solves, there's two ways. You can donate on the main page, chip in a few bucks a month, and you'll be surprised at how many people chipping in a few bucks a month can lead to a lot of cases getting funded. And then the other thing is you can browse cases that we've already onboarded for which we need to fund that specific case, and you can do a one-time contribution to fund that one case. And every time you do it, you're doing two things. You're helping solve a case for a family that doesn't know what happened to their loved one, but you're also building up that use case and applying pressure, right, to everyone else, because every time that case solves and we're like, look, all we had to do is get some funding, then it really makes it hard to argue that there are other bottlenecks in the process. And it's real momentum for us to take to the state and federal government to say, look, why are we double taxing Americans? Let's get some legislation in place. Let's get some resourcing. Let's go work these cases directly.
Right. My final question for you. How much is this technology going to change in the next 5 years or so?
Man, 5 years feels like a century. I think in the next
Right.
18 months, we will be nearly fully automated. Actually, I think it's less than 18 months. We'll be nearly fully automated in our ability to provide genealogical assistance on cases. There'll always be a human in the loop to review it, but I think a lot of that gets simplified. I think a lot of legislative barriers in the next 24 months will be unlocked. And so if you look in the next 5 years, I would hope that NamUs is, at least 10 times smaller than it used to be. And that's in spite of its growth and more people coming in to add cases.
I'm gonna add another question to you because I think this is a good one
Okay.
about the backlog of sexual offense evidence collection kits.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So there was a lot of outrage as we were discussing from the American public, and the government acted and said we got to get through these rape kits. But here's the thing: is that less than half of the time when you run the evidence from a sex assault kit, using the conventional CODIS system, do you get a hit? So even though you feel like you've ended the backlog, you haven't ended the backlog. You've ended the backlog of untested kits, and now you've created a backlog of unsolved kits. So if you've already gone through the time and the money and the effort to get the DNA from that kit, and there hasn't been a hit in CODIS, there should be a law. There should be a law that says if you've not gotten an answer with CODIS, use another method. Why would you go through the trouble to take the kit, get the DNA? You re-traumatize the victim just to even collect the DNA in the first place. Why would he do all that and then say, well, I'm sorry, there's no hit in CODIS, we're done. So there should be a mandate to take the DNA that is not hit in CODIS and go figure it out. Go use another technique like forensic genetic genealogy and get the answer. And we've had wild success doing it. In fact, sexual assaults are generally, as I'm sure you know, a repeat crime. And so there are a small number of people doing most of these terrible things, and they fly undetected because the kit wasn't tested. They're not in CODIS. Test them all, figure out who they are, and solve many cases at once. We identified a serial sexual predator in Vegas. He died in a car accident. He would have never made it to CODIS, but he was behind several sex assaults and a few homicides because, after you've sexually assaulted people a few times, then you might escalate. Then you're killing people. And so all of these cases solved because they took a different approach and didn't depend exclusively on CODIS. Those cases should all be tested. And people should be very clear that running a DNA test is not ending a backlog. It's when you identify the person responsible that you're then able to say you've cleared the case.
Final question for you, Dave. What if a case is 50 years old? Is there any time frame on this now with the
I
technology
mean,
that is out there?
we identified remains, people that are 200 years old. So as long as a crime happened in the last 200 years, we'll find the person. I can't be more clear, and obviously we're out of time, but the technology has become so advanced just in the last 24 months to where it just doesn't matter. If there's DNA, there's an ID that's possible. It just needs to be prioritized. Unsolved crimes a choice.
Very good. That was fascinating. I could speak to you for hours.
I know.
This is amazing. This
Let's
is a lot of
take the
fun.
rest of our
That
Sunday.
hour
I'll come back sometime. Come up with questions. I'll
Okay.
come back. We'll chat more.
Sounds like a plan. Dave, you hang out 1 second. We're going to say goodbye to everybody.
Yes,
Take care,
sir.
everybody. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.